We had sat at a table for hours. We were bored, we were tired, and nobody showed any signs of moving. Somebody called for cigars. We all instinctively looked towards the speaker. Brisbane. Brisbane was a man of 35 years of age. He was a strong man. He was little over 6 feet in height, moderately broad in the shoulder. He did not appear to be stout, but on the other hand, he was certainly not thin. His small head was supported by a strong and sinewy neck. His broad, muscular hands appeared to possess a peculiar skill in breaking walnuts without the assistance of the ordinary cracker. And seeing him in profile, one could not help remarking the extraordinary breadth of his sleeves and the unusual thickness of his chest. Brisbane was one of those men who are commonly spoken of among men as deceptive. That is to say that though he looked exceedingly strong, he was, in reality, very much stronger than he looked. Everybody knows Brisbane. When he asked for a cigar, everybody looked at him. "It's a very singular thing," said Brisbane. Everybody stopped talking. Now, Brisbane's voice was not loud, but possessed a peculiar quality of penetrating the general conversation and cutting it like a knife. Everybody listened. Brisbane, perceiving that he had attracted their general attention, lit his cigar with great equanimity. "It is a very singular thing," he continued, "that thing about ghosts. People are always asking whether anybody has seen a ghost. I have." "Oh, bosh! What, you? You don't mean to say so, Brisbane? Well, for a man of your intelligence." A chorus of exclamations greeted Brisbane's remarkable statement. Everybody called for cigars, and Stubbs, the butler, suddenly appeared from the depths of nowhere with a fresh bottle of dry champagne. The situation was saved. Boredom was over. Brisbane was going to tell a story. "I am an old sailor," said Brisbane, "and as I have to cross the Atlantic pretty often, I have my favorites. Now, most men have their favorites. I've seen a man wait in Broadway bar for 3/4 of an hour for a particular car which he liked. I believe the barkeeper made at least 1/3 of his living by that man's preference. I I have a habit of waiting for certain ships when I'm obliged to cross the duck pond. Now, it may be a prejudice on my part, but I was never cheated out of a good passage but one time in my life. And I remember that one time very well. It was a warm morning in June, and the custom house officials, who were hanging about waiting for a steamer already on her way up from the quarantine, they presented a peculiarly hazy and thoughtful appearance. Now, I had not much luggage. I never have. I mingled with the crowds of passengers and porters and officious individuals in blue coats and brass buttons, who seemed to spring up like mushrooms from the deck of a moored steamer to obtrude their unnecessary services upon the independent passenger. I have often noticed with a certain interest the spontaneous evolution of these fellows. There are none of them there when you arrive. 5 minutes after the pilot is called "Go ahead," they, or at least their blue coats and brass buttons, have disappeared from deck and gangway as completely as though they've just been consigned to that locker which tradition unanimously ascribes to Davy Jones. Yeah. But at the moment of starting, there they are, clean-shaved, blue-coated, ravenous for fees. Much like the TSA of today, I think he's saying. I hastened on board. The Kamchatka was one of my favorite ships. I say was, because, she emphatically no longer is. I cannot conceive of any inducement which would entice me to make another voyage in her. Yes, I know what you're going to say. She is uncommonly clean in the run aft. She has enough bluffing off in the bows to keep her dry, and the lower berths are most of them double. She has a lot of advantages. But I will not cross the pond in her again. Excuse my digression. I got on board. I hailed a steward whose red nose and redder whiskers were equally familiar to me. 105 lower berth, said I, in the business-like tone peculiar to men who think no more of crossing the Atlantic than taking a whiskey cocktail to downtown Delmonico's. The steward took my portmanteau, greatcoat and rug. Now, I shall never forget the expression of his face. Not that he turned pale. It is maintained by the most eminent divines that even miracles cannot change the course of nature. I have no hesitation in saying that he did not turn pale, but from his expression I judged that he was either about to shed tears, to sneeze, or to drop my portmanteau. As it later contained 2 bottles of particularly fine old Scotch presented to me for my voyage by my old friend Snigginson Van Pickens, I felt very extremely nervous about him dropping it. But the store did none of these things. "Well, I'll be damned," said he in a low voice, and led the way. Now, I suppose my Hermes, as he led me to the lower regions, had had a little grog, but I said nothing, and I followed him. Now, 105 was on the port side, well aft. There was nothing remarkable about the stateroom 105. The lower berth, like most of them aboard the Kamchatka, was double. There was plenty of room. There was the usual washing apparatus, calculated to convey an idea of luxury to the mind of the North American Indian, perhaps. There were the usual inefficient racks of brown wood, in which it is more easy to hang a large-sized umbrella than the common toothbrush of commerce. Upon the uninviting mattresses were carefully folded together those blankets which a great modern humorist has aptly compared to cold buckwheat cakes. The question of towels, well, was left entirely to the imagination. The glass decanters were filled with a transparent liquid, faintly tinged with brown, but from which an odor less faint but not more pleasing ascended to the nostrils like a far-off seasick reminiscence of oily machinery. Sad-colored curtains half closed the upper berth. The hazy June daylight shed a faint illumination upon the desolate little scene. Oh, God, how I hate that stateroom. Yeah, it does sound appealing, doesn't it? The steward deposited my traps and looked at me as though he wanted to get away, probably in search of more passengers and more fees. It is always a good plan to start in favor with those functionaries, and I accordingly gave him certain coins there and then. I'll try and make you comfortable all I can," he remarked. "All I can," as he put the coins in his pocket. Nevertheless, there was a doubtful intonation in his voice which surprised me. Possibly his scale of fees had gone up, and he was not satisfied with what I had given him. But on the whole, I was inclined to think that, as he himself would have expressed it, he was the better for a glass. I was wrong about that, however, and I did the man an injustice. Nothing especially worthy of mention occurred that day. We left the pier punctually, and it was very pleasant to be fairly under way, for the weather was warm and sultry, and the motion of the steamer produced a refreshing breeze. Everybody knows what the first day at sea is like. People pace the decks and stare at each other, and occasionally meet acquaintances whom they did not know were to be on board. There's the usual uncertainty as to whether the food will be good or bad or indifferent, until the first 2 meals have put the matter beyond a doubt. There's the usual uncertainty about the weather, until the ship is fairly off Fire Island. The tables are crowded at first, and then suddenly thinned. Pale-faced people spring from their seats and precipitate themselves towards the door. Each old sailor breathes more freely as his seasick neighbors rush from his side, leaving him plenty of elbow room at the table and an unlimited command over the mustard. One passage across the Atlantic is very much like another, and we who cross very often do not make the voyage for the sake of novelty. Whales and icebergs are indeed always objects of interest, and rarely one sees an iceberg at close quarters. To the majority of us, the most delightful moment of the day on board an ocean steamer was when we have taken our last turn on deck, have smoked our last cigar, and having succeeded in tiring ourselves, feel at liberty to turn in with a clear conscience. On that first night of the voyage, I felt particularly lazy, and went to bed in 105 rather earlier than I usually do. As I turned in, I was amazed to see that I was to have a companion. A portmanteau, very like my own, lay in the opposite corner, and in the upper berth had been deposited a neatly folded rug with a stick and umbrella. I had hoped to be alone, and I was disappointed. But I wondered who my roommate was to be, and so I determined to have a look at him. Before I had been long in bed, he entered. He was, as far as I could see, a very tall man, very thin, very pale, with sandy hair and whiskers and colorless gray eyes. He had about him, I thought, an air of rather dubious fashion, the sort of man you might see in Wall Street, without being able precisely to say what he was doing there, the sort of man who frequents the Café Anglais, who always seems to be alone, who drinks champagne. You might meet him on a racecourse, but he would never appear to be doing anything there either. He would appear to be a little overdressed, a little odd. There are 3 or 4 of his kind on every ocean steamer. I made up my mind that I did not care to make this man's acquaintance, and I went to sleep saying to myself that I would study his habits in order to avoid him. That is to say, if he rose early, I would rise late. If he went to bed late, I would go to bed early. I did not care to know this man. If you once know people of that kind, they're always turning up. Poor fellow. I need not have taken the trouble to come to so many decisions about him, for I never saw him again after that first night in 105. I was sleeping soundly when I was suddenly waked by a loud noise. To judge from the sound, my roommate must have sprung with a single leap from the upper berth to the floor. I heard him fumbling with the latch and bolt of the door, which opened almost immediately, and then I heard his footsteps as he ran at full speed down the passage, leaving the door open behind him. The ship was rolling a little, and I expected to hear him stumble or fall, but he ran as though he were running for his life. The door swung on its hinges with the motion of the vessel, and the sound annoyed me. I got up and shut it. I groped my way back to my berth in the darkness. I went back to sleep again, but I have no idea how long I slept. When I awoke, it was still quite dark, but I felt a disagreeable sensation of cold, and it seemed to me the air was damp. You know the peculiar smell of a cabin which has been wet with seawater? I covered myself up as well as I could, and I dozed off again, framing complaints to be made the next day and selecting the most powerful epithets in the language. I could hear my roommate turn over in the upper berth above me. He had probably returned while I was asleep. Once I thought I heard him groan, and I argued that he must be seasick. That is particularly unpleasant when one is in the berth below. Nevertheless, I dozed off, and I slept till early daylight. The ship was rolling heavily, much more than on the previous evening, and the grey light which came in through the porthole changed in tint with every movement according as the angle of the vessel's sides turned the glass seawards or skywards. It was very cold, unaccountably so for the month of June. I turned my head and I looked at the porthole, and to my surprise it was wide open and hooked back. I believe I swore audibly. Then I got up and I shut it. As I turned back, I glanced at the upper berth. The curtains were drawn close together. My companion had probably felt as cold as I. It struck me that I had slept enough. The stateroom was uncomfortable, though, strange to say, I could not smell the dampness which had annoyed me in the night. My roommate was still asleep, apparently. Excellent opportunity for avoiding him. So I dressed at once and I went on deck. The day was warm and cloudy, with an oily smell on the water. It was 7 o'clock as I came out, much later than I had imagined. I came across the doctor, who was taking his first sniff of the morning air. He was a young man from the west of Ireland, a tremendous fellow, with black hair and blue eyes, already inclined to be stout. He had a happy-go-lucky, healthy look about him, which was rather attractive. "Fine morning," I remarked by way of introduction. "Well," said he, eyeing me with an air of ready interest, "it's a fine morning, and it's not a fine morning, and I don't think it's much of a morning at all." "Well, no, it's not really so very fine," said I. "It's just what I call fugly weather," replied the doctor. "Oh, it was very cold last night, I thought," I remarked. However, when I looked about, I found that the porthole was wide open. I had not noticed it when I went to bed, and the stateroom was damp, too. Your room was damp, was it? Whereabouts are you, anyway, sir?" "Well, I'm in stateroom 105. To my surprise, the doctor started visibly and stared at me. What's the matter?" I asked him. "Oh, nothing," he answered. "Only, well, everybody has complained of that stateroom for the last 3 trips." "Huh, I shall complain too. It has certainly not been properly aired. It's a shame." I don't believe it can be helped," answered the doctor. "I believe there's something. It's not my business to frighten passengers, so "Well, you need not be afraid of frightening me," I replied. I can stand any amount of damp, and I should get a bad cold. If I get a bad cold from it, I'll come to you, all right?" I offered the doctor a cigar, which he took and examined very critically. "Well, sir, you see, it's not so much the damp," he remarked. "However, I dare say you'll get on very well. Have you a roommate, then?" "Oh, yes, I do. Don't you ask. He's a deuce of a fellow who bolts out in the middle of the night and leaves the door open." Again, the doctor looked curiously at me. Then he lit the cigar and looked grave. "And, Did he come back then, sir? Oh, yes, he came back. I was asleep, but I waked up and I heard him moving. Then I felt cold and went to sleep again. This morning I found the porthole open. Aye, sir, look here. I don't care much for this ship. I don't care a rap for a reputation. I'll tell you what I will do. I have a good-sized place up here. I'm the ship's doctor, after all. I'll share it with you, though I don't know you from Adam, right? I was very much surprised at the proposition. I could not imagine why he, the ship's doctor, should take a sudden interest in my welfare. However, his manner as he spoke of the ship was very peculiar. Well, you're very good, doctor, but really, I believe even now the cabin could be aired or cleaned out or something. Oh, but tell me, why do you not care for the ship? Well, replied the doctor, we are not superstitious in our profession, sir, not at all, not at all. But the sea, aye, the sea does breed superstition in people, don't it? Now, I don't want to prejudice you. I don't want to frighten you. But if you will take my advice, you'll move in here with me. I would as soon see you overboard as know that you or any other man was to sleep in 105 another night. Oh, good gracious, why? I asked. Well, it's just because yet on the last 3 trips, the people who have slept there actually have gone overboard, you see. Intelligence was startling and exceedingly unpleasant, I confess. I looked hard at the doctor to see whether he was making game of me, but he looked perfectly serious. I thanked him warmly for his offer, but I told him I intended to be the exception to the rule by which everyone who slept in that particular stateroom went overboard. He did not say much, but looked as grave as ever. He hinted that before we got across, I should probably reconsider his proposal. In the course of time, we went to breakfast, at which only an inconsiderable number of passengers assembled. I noticed that 1 or 2 of the officers who breakfasted with us looked grave. After breakfast, I went into my stateroom in order to get a book. The curtains of the upper berth were still closely drawn. Not a word was to be heard. My roommate was probably still asleep. As I came out, I met the steward whose business it was to look after me. He whispered that the captain wanted to see me. Then he scuttled away down the passage as if very anxious to avoid any questions from me. I went toward the captain's cabin. I found him waiting for me. Sir, I want to ask a favor of your place. I answered that I would do anything to oblige him, of course. Sir, where to? Your roommate has disappeared. He is known to have turned in early last night. Did you, notice anything extraordinary in his manner, sir? The question, coming as it did in exact confirmation of the fears the doctor had expressed half an hour earlier, staggered me. You don't mean to say he's gone overboard? I asked. Yes, I fear he has, answered the captain. Why, that is the most extraordinary thing, I began. Why? He asked. Well, he's the 4th, then, I explained. In answer to another question from the captain, I explained, without mentioning the doctor, that I had heard the story concerning 105. The captain seemed very much annoyed at hearing that I knew of it. I told him what had occurred in the night. Well, what you say, sir, coincides almost exactly with what was told me by the roommates of 2 of the other 3. They bolt out of bed and run down the passage. 2 of them were seen to go overboard by the watch. We stopped and lowered boats, but they were not found. Nobody, however, saw or heard the man who was lost last night. If he is really lost. The steward, who is a superstitious fellow, perhaps, and expected something to go wrong, went to look for him this morning and found his berth empty, but his clothes lying about just as he had left them. The steward was the only man on board who knew him by sight, and he's been searching everywhere for him. He's disappeared. Now, sir, I want to beg you not to mention the circumstances to any of the passengers. I don't want the ship to get a bad name, you see, and nothing hangs about an ocean goer like stories of suicides, eh? You shall have your choice of any one of the officers' cabins you like, including my own, for the rest of the passengers. Is that a fair bargain? Very fair, said I, and I'm very much obliged to you. But since I'm alone and have the stateroom to myself, apparently, I would rather not move. If the steward will take out that unfortunate man's things, I would as lief stay where I am. I will not say anything about the matter, and I think I can promise you that I will not follow my roommate overboard. The captain tried to dissuade me from my intention, but I preferred having a stateroom alone to being the chum of any officer on board. Now, I do not know whether I acted foolishly, but if I had taken his advice, I should have had nothing more to tell you tonight. There would have remained the disagreeable coincidence of several suicides occurring among men who had slept in the same cabin as me, but that would have been all. No, that was not the end of the matter, however, by any means. I obstinately made up my mind that I would not be disturbed by such tales. I even went so far as to argue the question with the captain. There was something wrong about the stateroom, I said. It was rather damp. The porthole had been left open last night. My roommate might have been ill when he came on board, and he might have become delirious after he went to bed. He might even now be hiding somewhere on board and might be found later. The place ought to be aired and the fastenings of the port looked to. If the captain would give me leave, I would see that what I thought was necessary would be done immediately. Well, sir, of course you have the right to stay where you are if you so please. But I wish you would turn out and let me lock the place up and be done with it, replied the captain petulantly. Now, I did not see it in the same light and left the captain after promising to be silent concerning the disappearance of my companion. The latter had had no acquaintance on board and was not missed in the course of the day. Towards evening, I met the doctor again. He asked me whether I had changed my mind. I told him I had not. Well, you will change your mind before long, he said gravely. We played whist that evening, and I went to bed late. Now, I will confess now that I felt a disagreeable sensation when I entered my stateroom. I could not help thinking of the tall man I had seen in the previous night, who was now dead, drowned, tossing about in the long swell 200 or 300 miles astern. Welcome, Jacko. His face rose very distinctly before me as I undressed, and I even went so far as to draw back the curtains of the upper berth as though to persuade myself that he was actually gone. I also bolted the door of the stateroom. Suddenly I became aware that the porthole was open and fastened back. Now this was more than I could stand. I hastily threw on my dressing gown. I went in search of Robert, the steward of my passage. I was angry, very angry, I remember. When I found him, I dragged him roughly to the door of 105 and pushed him towards the open porthole. What the deuce do you mean, you scoundrel, by leaving that port open every night? Don't you know it's against the regulations? Don't you know that if the ship heeled and the water began to come in, 10 men couldn't shut it? I will report you to the captain, you blackguard, for endangering the ship. I was exceedingly wroth with the man, and the man trembled and turned pale, and then began to shut the round glass plate with the heavy brass fittings. Why don't you answer me? If you please, sir, faltered the dread steward Robert, there's nobody on board as can keep this air port shut at night. You can try it yourself, sir. I ain't a-going to stop any longer on board of this vessel, sir. I ain't indeed. But if I was you, sir, I'd just clear out of this room and go sleep with the surgeon or something, I would. Look here, sir. Is that fastened what you may call securely or not, sir? You try it yourself. You see if it'll move a hitch at all. I tried the port. I found it perfectly tight. Well, sir, continued Robert triumphantly, I wager my reputation as A1 steward, an A1 dread steward, that in half an hour it'll be open again. Fastened back too, sir. That's a horrible thing. It'll be open and fastened back. I examined the great brass screw and the looped nut that ran on it. If I find it open in the night, Robert, I will give you a sovereign. It's not possible. You may go. Oh, a sovereign, did you say, sir? Aye, very good, sir. Thank you, sir. Good night, sir. Pleasant repose, sir, and all manner of enchanting dreams, sir. Robert scuttled away, delighted at being released. Of course, I thought he was trying to account for his negligence by a silly story intended to frighten me, and I disbelieved him. The consequence was that he got his sovereign, and I spent a very peculiarly unpleasant night. I went to bed, and 5 minutes after I had rolled myself up in the blankets, the inexorable Robert extinguished the light that had burned steadily behind the ground glass pane near the door. I lay quite still in the dark, trying to go to sleep, but I soon found that impossible. It had been some satisfaction to be angry with the steward, and the diversion had banished that unpleasant sensation I had at first experienced when I thought of the drowned man who had been my chum the night before. But I was no longer sleepy, and I lay awake for some time, occasionally glancing at the porthole, which I could just see from where I lay, and which in the darkness looked like a faintly luminous soup plate suspended in the blackness. I believe I must have lain there for an hour, and as I remember, I was just dozing into sleep when I was roused by a draught of cold air, and by distinctly feeling the spray of the sea blown upon my face. I started to my feet, and not having allowed in the dark for the motion of the ship, I was instantly thrown violently against the stateroom upon the couch which was placed beneath the porthole. I recovered myself immediately, however, and climbed upon my knees. That damned porthole was again wide open and fastened back. Now, these things are facts. I was wide awake when I got up, and I should certainly have been waked by the fall had I still been dozing. Moreover, I bruised my elbows and knees badly, and the bruises were there the following morning to testify to the fact, if I myself doubted it. That porthole was wide open and fastened back. A thing, I think, so unaccountable that I remember very well feeling astonishment rather than fear when I discovered it. I at once closed the plate again. I screwed down the loop nut with all my strength. It was very dark in the stateroom. I reflected that the port had certainly been opened within an hour after Robert had at first shut it in my presence, and I determined to watch it and see whether it would open again. Those brass fittings are very heavy and by no means easy to move. I could not believe that the clump had been turned by the shaking of the screw. I stood peering out through the thick glass at the alternate white and gray streaks of the sea that foamed beneath the ship's sides. I must have remained there for a quarter of an hour. Suddenly, as I stood, I distinctly heard something moving behind me in one of the berths. And a moment afterwards, just as I turned instinctively to look, though I could, of course, see nothing in the darkness, I heard a very faint groan. I sprang across the stateroom. I tore the curtains of the upper berth aside, thrusting my hands to discover if there were anyone in there. There was someone. I remember that the sensation as I put my hands forward was as though I were plunging them into the air of a damp cellar, and from behind the curtains came a gust of wind that smelled horribly of stagnant seawater. I laid hold of something that had the shape of a man's arm, but was smooth and wet and icy cold. But suddenly, as I pulled, the creature sprang violently forward against me, a clammy, oozy mass, as it seemed to me, heavy and wet, yet endowed with a sort of supernatural strength. I reeled across the stateroom. In an instant the door opened and the thing rushed out. I had not had time to be frightened, and quickly recovering myself, I sprang through the door and gave chase at the top of my speed, but I was too late. 10 yards before me I could see, I am sure I saw it, a dark shadow moving in the dimly lighted passage, quickly as the shadow of a fast horse thrown before a dog-cart by the lamp on a dark night. But in a moment it disappeared, and I found myself holding on to the polished rail that ran along the bulkhead where the passage turns toward the companion. My hair stood on end, and the cold perspiration rolled down my face. I'm not ashamed of it in the least. I was very badly frightened. Still, I doubted my senses, and I pulled myself together. It was absurd, I thought. The Welsh rarebit I had eaten had disagreed with me. I had been in a nightmare. I made my way back to my stateroom, and I entered it with an effort. The whole place smelled of stagnant seawater, as it had when I waked in the previous evening. It required my utmost strength to go in and grope among my things for a box of wax lights. As I lighted a railway reading lantern, which I always carry in case I want to read after lamps are out, I perceived the porthole was again open. A sort of creeping horror began to take possession of me, which I had never felt before, nor wished to feel again. But I got out a light, and I proceeded to examine the upper berth, expecting to find it drenched with seawater. I was disappointed. The bed had been slept in, and the smell of the sea was strong, but the bedding was dry as a bone. I fancied that Robert had not had the courage to make the bed after the accident of the previous night. It had all been a hideous dream. Yes. It was just a bad dream, I'm sure. I drew the curtains back as far as I could and examined the place very carefully. It was perfectly dry. But the porthole was open again. With a sort of dull bewilderment and horror, I closed it and I screwed it down, and thrusting my heavy stick through the brass loop, I wrenched it with all my might, till the thick metal began to bend under the pressure. And I hooked my reading lantern into the red velvet at the head of the couch, and I sat down to recover my senses if I could. I sat there all night, unable to think of rest, hardly able to think at all. But the porthole remained closed, I did not believe it would now open again without the application of a considerable force. The morning dawned at last, and I dressed myself slowly, thinking over all that had happened in the night. It was a beautiful day, and I went on deck, glad to get out into the early, pure sunshine and to smell the breeze from the blue water, so different from the noisome, stagnant odor of my stateroom. Now, some of you may be predicting that be no more sleeping in that room for this man, but, well, you might be wrong about that. Instinctively, he turned aft towards the surgeon's cabin, and there the doctor stood, pipe in his mouth, taking his morning airing precisely as on the preceding day. Now, don't get me wrong, I would bet the same way as you. However, wouldn't be as much of a story then. Well, good morning to you, sir, the surgeon said quietly, but looking at me with evident curiosity. Doctor, you are right. There is something wrong about that place. Hey, I thought you'd change your mind, he said rather triumphantly. You've had a bad night, have you? Shall I make you pick me up? I have a capital recipe. Well, no thanks, Doc. I'd like to tell you what happened to me. I then tried to explain as clearly as possible precisely what had occurred, not omitting to state that I had been as scared as I had ever been scared in all my life before. I dwelt particularly on the phenomenon of the porthole, which was a fact to which I could testify, even if the rest had been an illusion. I had closed it twice in the night, and the second time I had actually bent the brass and wrenching it with my stick. I believe I insisted a good deal on this point. Hey, you seem to think that I'm likely to doubt your story, said the doctor, smiling at the detailed account of the state of the porthole. But I do not doubt it in the least. I renew my invitation to you, sir. Bring your traps here and take half my cabin. Tell you what, Doctor. Instead, why don't you come and take half of my cabin for one night? Help me get to the bottom of this thing. Oh, you'll be getting to the bottom of something else, sir, if you try that, answered the doctor. The bottom of... what's that, Doctor? Hey, the bottom of the sea, sir. Hey, I'm going to leave this ship. It is not canny. Then you will not help me to find out? Not I, said the doctor quickly. It is my business to keep my wits about me, not to go fiddling about with ghosts and things. Do you really believe it is a ghost? I inquired rather contemptuously. But as I spoke, I remembered very well the horrible sensation of the supernatural which had got possession of me during the night. The doctor turned sharply upon me. Have you any reasonable explanation of these things to offer to me, sir? No, you have not. Well, you say you'll find an explanation? Hey, I say you won't, sir, simply because there is not any explanation to be found, sir. But, my dearest doctor, I retorted, do you, a man of science, mean to tell me that such things cannot be explained? I do so mean to tell you exactly that. And if they could be explained, I would not be concerned in the explanation myself. No, I did not care to spend another night alone in the stateroom. You might have been right. And yet I was obstinately determined to get to the root of the disturbances. Aha. I do not believe there are many men who would have slept there alone after passing 2 such nights. But I made up my mind to try it anyway, if I could not get anyone to share a watch with me. The doctor was evidently not inclined for such an experiment. He said he was a surgeon, and that in case any accident occurred on board, he must be always in readiness. He could not afford to have his nerves unsettled, he said. Perhaps he was quite right, but I am inclined to think that his precaution was prompted by his inclination. On inquiry, he informed me that there was no one on board who would be likely to join me in my investigations, and after a little more conversation, I left him. A little later, I had met the captain, and I told him my story. I said that if no one would spend the night with me, I would ask leave to have the light burning all night and try it alone. Now look here, sir. I will tell you what I will do, said the captain. I will share your watch myself, and we will see what happens. It is my belief that between the two of us we can figure it out. There may be some fellow skulking on board. Someone who steals passage by frightening the passengers. It's just possible there may be something queer in the carpentry of that berth of yours. Now, I suggested taking the ship's carpenter below and examining the place, but I was overjoyed at the captain's offer to spend the night with me. He accordingly sent for the workmen, and ordered him to do anything I required. We went below at once. I had all the bedding cleared out of the upper berth. We examined the place thoroughly to see if there's a board loose anywhere, or a panel which could be opened or pushed aside. We tried the planks everywhere. We tapped the flooring. We unscrewed the fittings of the lower berth. We took it to pieces. In short, there was not a square inch of that stateroom which was not searched and tested. Everything was in perfect working order, and we put everything back in its place. As we were finishing our work, the dread steward, Robert, came to the door and looked in. "Well, sir, did you find anything, sir?" he asked with a ghastly grin. "Huh. No, you're right about the porthole, Robert," I said, and I gave him the promised sovereign. The carpenter did his work silently and skillfully, following my directions. When he had done, he spoke. "I'm just a plain man, sir, but it's my belief you had better just turn out your things and let me run a half a dozen 4-inch screws to the door of this cabin. There's no good never came out of this cabin yet, sir. That's all about it. There's been 4 lives lost out here to my own remembrance, and that in 4 trips. Better give it up, sir. Better give it up." "Yes, well, I shall try it for one night more," I said. "You better give it up, sir. You better give it up. It's a precious bad job," repeated the workman, putting his tools in his bag and leaving the cabin. But my spirits had risen considerably at the prospect of having the captain's company, and I made up my mind not to be prevented from going to the end of this strange business. I abstained from the Welsh rarebits and grog that evening, and I did not even join in the customary game of whist. I wanted to be quite sure of my nerves, and my vanity made me anxious to make a good figure in the captain's eyes. The captain was one of those splendidly tough and cheerful specimens of seafaring humanity whose combined courage, hardihood, and calmness in difficulty leads him naturally into positions of trust. He was not the man to be led away by an idle tale, and the mere fact that he was willing to join me in the investigation was proof that he thought there was something seriously wrong, which could not be accounted for on ordinary theories nor laughed down as a common superstition. To some extent, too, his reputation was at stake, as well as the reputation of the ship. It is no light thing to lose passengers overboard, and he knew it. About 10 o'clock that evening, as I was smoking a last cigar, he came up to me, and he drew me aside from the beat of the other passengers who were patrolling the deck in the warm darkness. "This is a serious matter, Mr. Brisbane. We must make up our minds either way, to be disappointed or to have a pretty rough time of it. You see, I cannot afford to laugh at the affair, and I will ask you to sign your name to a statement of whatever occurs. If nothing happens tonight, sir, we will try it again tomorrow and the next day. Are you ready, Mr. Brisbane?" And so we went below. We entered the stateroom. As we went in, I could see Robert, the steward, who stood a little further down the passage, watching us with his usual grin, as though certain that something dreadful was about to happen. The captain closed the door behind us and bolted it. "Suppose you put your portmanteau before the door," he suggested. "One of us can sit on it. Nothing can get out that then. Is the port screwed down?" As I found it as I had left it in the morning, and indeed, without using a lever as I had done, no one could have opened it. I drew back the curtains of the upper berth so that I could well see into it. By the captain's advice, I lighted my reading lantern, and I placed it so that it shone upon the white sheets above. He insisted upon sitting on the portmanteau in front of the door himself, declaring that he wished to be able to swear that he had sat there before the door. Then he requested me to search the stateroom thoroughly, an operation very soon accomplished, as it consisted merely in looking beneath the lower berth and under the couch below the porthole. The spaces were quite empty. "It's impossible for any human being to get in here," I said, "or for any human being to open that port." "Very good," said the captain calmly. "If we see anything now, it must either be imagination or something supernatural." I sat down on the edge of the lower berth. "The first time it happened," said the captain, crossing his legs and leaning back against the door. "The first time it happened was in, March. The passenger who slept here in the upper berth turned out to have been a lunatic. At all events, he was known to have been a little touched, and he had taken his passage without the knowledge of his friends. He rushed out in the middle of the night and threw himself overboard before the officer who had watch could stop him. We stopped and lowered a boat. It was a quiet night, just before that heavy weather came on, but we could not find him. Of course, his suicide was afterwards accounted for on the ground of his insanity." "I suppose that often happens, then?" I remarked rather absently. "No, not often, no," said the captain. "Never before in my experience, though I have heard of it happening on board of other ships. Well, as I was saying, that occurred in March, on the very next trip. What are you looking at? He asked, stopping suddenly his narration. I believe I gave no answer. My eyes were riveted upon the porthole. It seemed to me that the brass loop was beginning to turn very slowly upon the screw. So slowly, however, that I was not sure it moved at all. I watched it intently, fixing its position in my mind and trying to ascertain whether it changed. Seeing where I was looking, the captain looked too. It moves, he exclaimed in a tone of conviction. No, it does not, he added after a minute. If it were the jarring of this screw, I said, it would have opened during the day, but I found it this evening jammed tight as I left it this morning. I rose and tried the nut. It was certainly loosened, but by an effort I could move it with my hands. The queer thing, said the captain, is that the second man who was lost was supposed to have got through that very port. We had a terrible time over it. It was in the middle of the night, and the weather was very heavy. There was an alarm that one of the ports was open and sea running in. I came below and found everything flooded, the water pouring in every time she rolled, and the whole port swinging back and forth from the top bolts, not the porthole in the middle. Well, we managed to shut it, but the water did some damage. Ever since, the place smells of seawater from time to time, as you noticed. We supposed the passenger had thrown himself out, though the Lord only knows how he did it. And Steward kept telling me he cannot keep anything shut here. Upon my word, I can smell it now, can't you? He inquired, sniffing the air suspiciously. Yes, distinctly, I said, and I shuddered as the same odor of stagnant seawater grew stronger in the cabin. Now, to smell like this, the place must be damp, I continued. And yet, when I examined it with the carpenter this morning, everything was perfectly dry. It was most extraordinary. Hello! My reading lantern, which had been placed in the upper berth, was suddenly extinguished. There was still a good deal of light from the pane of ground glass near the door, behind which gloomed the regulation lamp. The ship rolled heavily. The curtain of the upper berth swung far out of the stateroom and back again. I rose quickly from my seat on the edge of the bed, and the captain at the same moment started to his feet with a loud cry of surprise. I had turned with the intention of taking down the lantern to examine it when I heard his exclamation, and immediately afterwards his call for help. I sprang towards him. He was wrestling with all his might with the brass loop of the port. It seemed to turn against his hands in spite of all his efforts. I brought up my cane, a heavy oak stick which I always used to carry. I thrust it through the ring, and I bore it on with all my strength. But the strong wood snapped suddenly, and I fell upon the couch. When I rose again, the port was wide open. The captain was standing with his back against the door, pale to the lips. Sir, there is something in that berth, he cried in a strange voice, his eyes almost starting from his head. Hold the door while I look. It shall not escape us, whatever it is. But instead of taking its place, I sprang upon the lower bed, and I seized something which lay in the upper berth. It was something ghostly, horrible beyond words. It moved in my grip. It was like the body of a man long drowned, and yet it moved, and it had the strength of 10 men living, but I gripped it with all my might. The slippery, oozy, horrible thing. The dead wide eyes seemed to stare at me out of the dusk. The putrid odor of rank seawater was about it. Its shiny hair hung in foul, wet curls over its dead face. I wrestled with that dead thing. It thrust itself upon me and forced me back and nearly broke my arms. It wound its corpse's arms about my neck, the living death. It overpowered me, so that I at last cried aloud and fell and left my hold. As I fell, the thing sprang across me. It seemed to throw itself upon the captain. When I last saw him on his feet, his face was white, his lips were set. It seemed to me that he struck a violent blow at that dead being, and then he, too, fell forward upon his face with an inarticulate cry of horror. The thing paused an instant, seeming to hover over his prostrate body, and I could have screamed again for very fright, but I had no voice left. The thing vanished suddenly, and it seemed to my disturbed senses that it had made its exit through the open port, though how that was possible, considering the smallness of the aperture, is more than anyone can tell. I lay a long time upon the floor. The captain lay beside me. At last I partially recovered my senses, and I moved, and instantly I knew that my arm was broken, the small bone of the left forearm near the wrist. I got upon my feet somehow. With my remaining hand I tried to raise the captain. He groaned and moved, but at last came to himself. He was not hurt, but he seemed badly stunned. Well, do you want to hear more? There is nothing more. That's the end of my story. The carpenter carried out his scheme of running half a dozen 4-inch screws to the door of 105, and if ever you take the passage in Kamchatka, you may ask for a berth in that stateroom. You'll be told that it is engaged. Yes, engaged. It is engaged by that dead thing. I finished the trip in the surgeon's cabin. He doctored my broken arm. He advised me not to fiddle about with ghosts and things any more, that's what he said. Not to fiddle about with ghosts and things, huh? The captain was very silent, and never sailed again in that ship, though it is still running. And I will not sail in her either. It was a very disagreeable experience, and I was very badly frightened, which is a thing I do not like. That's all. That is how I saw a ghost. If there was a ghost. I was dead, anyhow. That is the story of the Upper Berth by Marion Crawford.